Good evening, everyone. I'm Chandna Singh Nirwan, and I welcome you all to the inaugural session of our project on women's identity and social control in association with Oxford University Press. The topic for today's session is Inter-caste marriages as represented in myth and folklore, social and cultural contexts. And I'm delighted to welcome our esteemed panelists, Ms. Saiswaroopa Iyer, Ms. Anuja Chandramouli, and Ms. Nandini Sengupta. I will now take a brief minute to introduce you all. Ms. Saiswaroopa Iyer is an alumnus of IIT Kharagpur and an investment professional turned satisfied writer. Saiswaroopa is the best-selling author of 4 novels, all based on legendary female protagonists from ancient Hindu literature. Her second novel, Avishi, based on a Rigvedic hymn, has been acquired for screen adaptation by a major studio. Rukmani is a recently released novel published by Rupa Publications. Saiswaroopa is passionate about ancient Indian history, philosophy, and literature. She holds a certificate in Puranas from Oxford School of Hindu Studies. As a trained classical singer, she has also been awarded a gold medal by Tirumala Tirupati Devasthanams. In her spare time, she likes to search for her next inspiration in books, pravachana's, and historical temples. She lives in Bengaluru with her husband and daughter. We welcome you, Sai.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for that flattering welcome, Chandra. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is all ours. Our next panelist is Ms. Anuja Chandramouli. She is a best-selling author and New Age Indian classicist, widely regarded as one of the finest writers in mythology, historical fiction, and fantasy. Her highly acclaimed debut novel, Arjuna, Saga of a Pandava Warrior Prince, was named as one of the top 5 sellers in the Indian writing category for the year 2012 by Amazon India. Her other books are Kamdev, the God of Desire, Shakti, the Divine Feminine, Yama's Lieutenant and its sequel, Yama's Lieutenant and the Stone Witch, Karthikeya, the Destroyer's Son, Prithviraj Chauhan, the Emperor of Hearts, Padmavati, the Burning Queen, Ganga, the Constant Goddess, and Muhammad bin Tughlaq, Tale of a Tyrant. Mohini the Enchantress is her latest work of mythological fiction and winner of the prestigious Popular Choice Author Award. Her Mahabharata with Anuja storytelling series is now available on YouTube. Her writings appear in various publications like the New Indian Express, The Hindu, Scroll.in, and Femina. We welcome you, Anuja.
Hi, Chandna. So happy to be here. Thanks so much for that lovely intro. Such a pleasure to be here.
Yes. Actually, like I said, the pleasure is all ours to have all three such esteemed panelists with us today. Our next panelist is Nandini Sengupta. She's a Pondicherry-based journalist and author of historical fiction and narrative history. After a chance visit to Ajanta-Ellora caves, she became fascinated with India's past in general and ancient India in particular. For the next 10 years, she read history for fun. Her book credits include the best-selling The Blue Horse and Other Amazing Animals from Indian History, publisher Hachette, which debuted in November 2020. The King Within and the Poisoned Heart, Book 1 and 2 of the Gupta Empire trilogy by HarperCollins India, and the story of Kalidas, the Gem Among Poets by Aiker Goddard Publications. The Ocean's Own, the third and final book in the Gupta Empire trilogy, has just debuted on bookshelves. Nandini is currently writing her first narrative non-fiction historical biography to be published in 2022. We welcome you, Nandini.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad and so honored to be part of this very esteemed panel. Thank you.
Moving on with the session, I now request Sai to say her ideas and say a few words on the topic intercaste marriage as represented in myth and folklore, social and cultural contexts.
So I'm going to be the one to bell the cat. Yeah. So I think I would want to begin by before we go into the intercaste element, right? I want to begin by setting the context for marriage, firstly. So the marriage, my understanding of ancient Indian marriages, it of course comes. It's rooted in the Dharma Shastras, but my favorite verse that summarizes a marriage comes from the Mahabharata, where Shakuntala explains the importance of wife to Dushmanta. She says, "Ardha bharya manushya भार्या श्रेष्ठतमः सखा भार्या मूलं त्रिवर्गस्य भार्या mitram arishyate." So basically a partnership, she says a wife is, the best friend, that she's half of the man. She is the best friend that a man can have. She is the source of trivarga, that is dharma, artha, kama, and she is a partner in moksha. So this shloka summarizes marriage to me. And the caste or varna, as we used to call it chatur varna. So the varna, as we call it, each of the varnas, right? The four varnas are also intricately connected to one of the four purusharthas, that is dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. So that is the context where we should try and understand the marriages in ancient history. Uh, do I hear someone? Sorry. Hello.
No,
Yeah, we
please
can hear
continue.
you.
Yeah, sure. So that is the context in which I would interpret, the word marriage as well as the word caste is from the varna and purushartha perspective. So to a union, right? And there were a lot of marriages that took place in the intervarna sphere. A lot of princesses used to get married to the rishis, and the most famous example is the union of Satyavati with, who's a fisherwoman, with King Shantanu, right? And Satyavati is also the mother of Vedavyasa, who gave us the bulk of our corpus, right? And her sons or her progeny, her descendants become the kings of Hastinapura. So we have a lot of, I mean, just name it, we can go on naming a lot of intervarna unions, but the base for a marriage are the purusharthas. So that's my beginning.
All right. That was quite an interesting take on the word marriage itself. Moving on to our next speaker, I would like to invite Ms. Anuja to share her ideas on the topic.
Yeah, thanks so much. Saiswaroopa loved listening to your intro on the subject. Really cool. And this is something I feel strongly about intercaste marriages and their relevance in a very social and cultural context even today. So, like Saiswarupa mentioned, intercaste unions were quite common. Although in those days it must be stressed that romantic love, as we know it, though it was talked about in the epics and stuff, it was not a very common occurrence. The arranged marriage tradition was followed, and marriage was also supposed to be something to maintain the political social core, basically, especially for royalty, which is why it was like Sai Swarupa mentioned earlier. There were lots of marriages between princesses belonging to royal houses and rishis, because it was believed their progeny would were meant for great things and stuff like that. One example, like she said, was Satyavati, and we also have another Satyavati who was Parashurama's grandmom. So she married sage Ruchika, and there was a little mix-up when she was trying to win herself a son, and she wanted to make sure her father also had a heir to perpetuate the line. And there was a case of they were Rigu's descendants. So when they were offered two bowls of payasa, I think, and Satyavati drank the one intended for her mum drank the one intended for her, which is why the sage, with his yogic vision, felt that Satyavati would have a son who would become a warrior. And meanwhile, the queen would have a son who would renounce the world and take up the Brahmin's lifestyle. So Satyavati said, please let my grandson be born that way, not my son. Which is why Parashurama, despite being born a Brahmin, had those warlike attributes which saw him decimate 21 lines of Kshatriya kings and Kshatriyas, basically. So that was, it's sort of like a cautionary tale here. It becomes a cautionary tale when you talk of an intercaste union. And this motif is pretty common here and there, okay, where they talk about how it sort of upsets the status quo when these marriages happen. So yeah, for great things to happen, a little bit of upsetting of the status quo is called for, I guess. And another example would be one which I'm very fond of is Shakuntala and Dushyant. So that's a very sweet story. And then you have Shavana and Sukanya. Then, of course, there's Devyani and Yayati, another character from the Mahabharata, of Devyani being a Brahmin girl who married a king, and of course, their children were, the progeny, were the ancestors of the Yadavas as well as the Pandava line, the Kuru line. So that's how it. There are many instances. Contrary to what people think today, intercaste unions were quite common, but they were the sort of exception which proved the norm, because they didn't do much to alter, to cause any kind of easing of the lines between the various castes. And it was, in a way, these unconventional unions only served to make people dig their heels a little deeper, and to maintain the clannish attitude which we see in evidence even today. Despite everything, though today intercaste unions are more common than ever before, it is still, the majority of people still opt to marry within their caste, and the caste lines are very strictly maintained. And we read about horrible stories, we hear about honor killings and things like that today, because our mentality hasn't changed over the years. And now people keep talking about the scriptures suggesting that we should honor the caste system, but I beg to differ, because it was originally for purposes of convenience. It was about, it's sort of like an aptitude test, and letting people choose a particular career suited to their skill sets. And it became something more with time, which led to a lot of discrimination, intolerance, and hate. I would like to share a small story here. It's about Sage Uttanka. It's one of my favorites, and he's a devotee of Vishnu, and as such, he wins a boon from Lord Vishnu. And he would have seen Vishnu's Vishwaroopa. So when Vishnu offered him this boon, he initially turned it down. He said, "Now that I've seen you in all your glory, I don't really need anything else." But when the god was insistent, he said, "Okay, when I do my meditation in the desert, I get thirsty. So, when I think of you, could you just quench my thirst?" And Vishnu agreed to this. And when Uttanka felt the thirst demons tormenting him, he immediately turned his mind to Vishnu. And Vishnu summoned Indra, and he said, "I think sage Uttanka deserves a portion of Amrita, the nectar of immortality." And Indra said, "Are you sure? Why would you honor a mortal with such a privilege? Are you sure he deserves it?" Vishnu said, "He's my devotee. I have faith in him." Indra said, "Then you won't object if I put him to the test." And Vishnu said, "Sure, do whatever you think is right." So the sage, meanwhile, his thirst is building, and he's wondering, "Oh, what the hell? I was granted a boon, so how come I have no access to water?" And then suddenly he saw this hideous-looking Chandala, okay, and he was filled with revulsion. It's bad enough I'm so thirsty. Now, why does this person have to come here? And they say that this Chandala was carrying a bowl with water, and he offered it. He said, "I can see that you're tormented by thirst. Please allow me to quench it." And Uttanka was grossed out, and he said, "Of course, I can't accept this from you." And when he berated Vishnu, he said, "See, you gave me a boon, and now you've let me down like this." And then Vishnu told him, "See, that was the nectar of immortality, and it was offered to you by Indra, and it was a test which you failed." So again, this whole concept of untouchability, impurity, it is not something which was necessarily endorsed in Indian mythology in any form, actually. Like I said, it was the Varnas were for convenience sake. It was not to discriminate and use it as an excuse to, suppress other people. So it's very, very sad that we've distorted our own mythology, and we've used that to bolster extremely inhuman practices. So I just feel we should talk about it and clarify these misconceptions which we have, so that we can work towards a caste-free society.
All right, thanks, Anuja. That was quite interesting. Moving on to our next panelist, Nandini. I think she'll like to talk about the historical aspect of it. We're waiting to hear you.
Thank you, Chandana. Sai and Anuja have given very interesting aspects of caste from our itihasa. I am going to talk a little bit about history and why there are examples. There are very good, interesting examples of intercaste marriages in our history, not only in medieval India but also in ancient India. And very quickly, I want to give some examples and try and connect the dots and see why these examples stand out. So, one of the earliest examples of not only intercaste but interracial marriage is, of course, when Chandragupta Maurya married Seleucus Nicator's daughter Helena. She was a pagan Greek, he was Jain. So, this is one of the earliest examples that we have, and then in the first century CE, we have this very interesting interracial marriage, which is mentioned in the Korean text, Samguk Yusa. It is about the Gaya kingdom, and it says that in 48 AD, King Kim Suro of Gaya, who's the founder of the Jimhae Kim clan and the founder of Korea, he took a princess, Princess Hyo, from the Ayutha nation or Ayodhya. So she was a North Indian Ayodhya princess who traveled all the way to Korea and became their revered queen. And if we go a little bit down the years, in the 10th century CE, in the 7th century, we find the Kalachuri king Karnadeva. He marries a Hun princess, and her name is Abala Devi. And then about 200-300 years later, in the around the mid 10th century, we find Guhila king Alat, who marries another Hun princess, and her name is Hariya Devi. So so these examples abound. Of course, the most well-known example of intercaste marriage, I feel, is in medieval times, in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century, when Durgavati, who is a Chandela princess, marries Dalpat Shah, or Dalpati Shah as he was called, who was a Rajgond. And Anuja was talking about how love marriages or falling in love and then marrying somebody as opposed to marrying for the sake of your lineage and all that was less common. This example is so special because here she was a Chandela princess, she was Rajput, she runs away and she marries this Rajgond prince. And Abul Fazl actually talks about it in the Akbarnama, and he's very disapproving, strangely enough. And he says the only reason why her father allows her finally to marry this Gond prince is because the kingdom he came from, which was Gadha Mandla or Gadha Katanga, was very, very powerful. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are many examples of intercaste marriages, particularly among the Rajput aristocracy and Rajput royalty. And this is particularly significant and very common, more common than elsewhere in India, in central India. The reason for that is many of the central Indian kingdoms were controlled by Rajput rulers, Hai Rajputs, Kalachuri Rajputs, Chandela Rajputs, Baghels, and so on. And they, at some point, had to co-opt the tribal societies in which they lived. And therefore, you see intermarriages, intercaste marriages. In fact, if you look at Durgavati and Dalpati, theirs is not the first marriage in that dynasty. The founder of the dynasty, Yadav Rai or Yadav Rai, who is a Brahmin, started the dynasty by marrying Ratnabali, who is the Gond princess. So the point I'm trying to make here is, by the time we come to the mid first millennium CE, and certainly right up until the mid second millennium CE, for about 1,000 odd years, we find that there are many examples of intercaste marriages which are driven by diplomatic or tactical political reasons, and the rulers and the families that are entering into these relationships, or into these wedding marital relationships, do so for a very specific purpose. We have to also understand that the Kachwaha Rajputs were the first to offer their daughter in marriage to the Mughals. That too was in a sense a tactical wedding, was it not? Because they recognized that this was the growing power, and they wanted to turn a potential enemy into a kinsman. And in many of these cases that are mentioned here, that I'm talking about, we find that this diplomacy plus exigency plus tactical marital relationships plays out in many of these cases. A quick word here about the folklore, about which I hope Chandna will allow me to speak a little bit more later on in the show. If we look at the folklore of the region of central India, folklore belonging to the Gonds, to the Baigas, the Marias, the Bhils, all the tribes all along central India, we find that there are many examples of intercaste love affairs, intercaste marriages. In fact, there are examples of Rajput and Baiga, Rajput and Gond, Brahmin and Gond, Brahmin and Baiga. Many examples. They keep popping up. And in fact, if you have time and you check out this beautiful collection of books written by Verrier Elwin, and he's written several volumes, Verrier Elwin and Shamrao Hibale. They have documented examples of this kind of intercaste unions in the folklore. And I feel that pops up so often in this part because the aristocracy of central India were already doing this. So the folklore kind of takes its cue from what was happening among the kings and queens of the lands in which these tribes lived. And interestingly enough, whereas the Rajputs were marrying tribal Gonds and vice versa, Gonds were, so there was both Anuloma and Pratiloma marriages happening in central India. If you go to Rajasthan, you will find that although the Bhil tribes are very much part of their army, there are not that many examples. In fact, there are no examples of intercaste or interracial love stories in their folklore. So clearly, this particular phenomenon was more common in central India because the folk narratives were taking their cue from the ruling or aristocratic classes in this region, which is, current Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, parts of Orissa, and parts of Maharashtra. And over the next half hour or so, I hope I shall get some chance to give a little bit more extra detail about some of the folk stories that document this kind of love.
Yeah,
over to
absolutely.
you, Chandra.
Thank you, Nandini, for bringing that point in the conversation about the tribes and folklore and mythology, and about the history. Now, I was just wondering that the entrenched belief systems of the society are largely driven and inspired by the mythological and classical texts. For example, in Gita, Arjun says that when a woman marries outside her caste, she becomes impure. And the family she's married into, the ancestors, they don't accept the food offerings and the gates of the hell open for them. So, do you think that such beliefs impact the narrative of the contemporary society? All panelists are welcome to add their points.
So if I can enter,
Yes, yes,
so
please.
again we have to understand the match between Purushartha and a Varna. So when I say Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, and we have a Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, right? And in many ways, we follow the tasks of all these four Varnas in our daily lives also, right? So like Shudra Varna is very tightly connected to the Kama Purushartha. No, Kama is not just sexual or sensual, this one, but it is something which needs to be repeated over and again because it's the need, right? So, it can be cooking because you taste, you eat the food, it's done, the job is done, it's nothing remains, you have to cook all over again when get when you feel hungry. The same thing, right? I mean, I'm just giving a very crude example. So Shudra Varna is tightly coupled to those skill sets which need repetition of tasks. So people brought up in those, in that, in that atmosphere, they are highly skilled in performing these repetitive tasks. They would have innovated something locally. They would have become efficient in certain processes. So, intravarna marriage happens between a woman who is trained to support or take on certain tasks which are related to the varna, uh, along with a boy who also has a specialization, probably because husband was considered to be the guru of a wife. So that way, marriage for a woman became a sort of higher education, entry towards higher education, because she gets trained in advanced skill of whatever she is trained into by her husband, and both of them get to pursue their profession, right? So that way, intra-varna marriages were supposed to maintain that balance. So the children born to them, they'll acquire the skill of their parents and probably improve upon it or something. But again, the Purushartha is the guiding, it's the base of the whole principle. So when two individuals belonging to different varnas fall in love with each other, and they find the Purushartha match very well, that is when this exception gets approved. Like say Devayani and Yayati example that Anuja had given, right? And thankfully, Nandini brought up the Anuloma and Pratiloma difference here. Anuloma is, correct me if I'm wrong, but Anuloma is when a so-called lower, Varna woman marries a higher Varna man, which
Yes.
was never discouraged, because the status of the woman always is elevated. That was not discouraged. But pratiloma is where the status of woman gets, because a Brahmin woman, for instance, she's trained to probably, chant the mantras, oversee some religious ceremonies, and, she's trained to be in a certain lifestyle. And you expect her to become a queen, probably fight battles, look after treasury, and, that. So that is throwing a woman into a certain very uncertain atmosphere, and underconfident woman, right? And the child of that underconfident woman is not going to grow up into another confident individual. So that is what Arjuna was meaning. So when the war wipes out all of the Kshatriya clan, the Kshatriya women will be forced to marry, say, traders and farmers, and those women are not going to have, they are not trained for those skills, and there is going to be a lot of imbalance in that kingdom, and we are supposed to rule that kingdom. So he was never, Arjuna was never underconfident of their victory. He was always confident that the Pandavas are going to win it, because that is the level of skill that he had, his brothers had. So he was concerned about the imbalance in the king, that the the imbalance that would take over the kingdom at such a mass scale. It's not individual. If two individuals are in love with each other, they have their, so it can be approved as an exception. But at a mass level, if so many women get into professional households, I mean households with totally different profession, their confidence is totally battered, and their children are also going to be affected by this kind of lack of balance. And how are we going to handle that? That is it's not something that he says is a no, but that is something which is making him rethink of that mass destruction that is going to happen in the war. So that's how we have to interpret Arjuna's query that way. And yes, as Anuja said, it's not about discrimination. So we always have to understand that as a Varna, if I belong to a certain Varna, I am able to practice my Varna or my profession in peace because there are other three people supporting me in their own ways. There is a king, probably there is a king, and there is an army ruling ruling this country in peace. So, I can practice my writing. There's a farmer growing food. There are, people who are practicing their profession, which is indirectly enabling me. I don't have to worry about so many other aspects of life. So varnas exist in harmony with each other. That is something which we need to understand from our history. And once, if we don't respect harmony, that is when discrimination sets in, and the horrors that Anuja talked about, that are going to set in. When you disrespect the whatever is giving you that balance, when you disrespect it, right, and misinterpret it and disrespect that balance, that's when the kind of rigidity and the all the misunderstanding and whatever horrible consequences of that misunderstanding are going to seep in.
I have, while I agree mostly with Saiswaroopa, I have a slightly different take on your question overall regarding what Arjuna said. I've always felt that we need to acknowledge that for the longest time, our scriptures were entirely in the control of one community. Let's acknowledge that fact that it was the Brahmins who preserved a big chunk of Indian mythology. First, through oral tradition, which is a magnificent tradition. We would have lost so much if not for that. So we do owe the Brahmin community for preserving so much of our culture, our heritage, our treasures, basically. But we also need to acknowledge that when you have a monopoly over the material, a little bit of self-interest also seeps in. When you are the one who's interpreting this material, when you're the one who's disseminating this information, so there, I've always felt there's an element of self-interest over here, because as Saiswaroopa mentioned, we have the original four varnas, but in today's world, it's not like it comes down. Who knows who's a Vaishya, who's a Shudra, the highborn Kshatriyas, we know the Rajputs have that lineage or whatever even today. And of course, the Brahmins. But what about the others? There are like hundreds of communities out there which came in, which just mushroomed over the eons, right? That also happened, and we don't acknowledge that in the narrative. You keep talking about Brahmin versus Dalit, and you forget that there are hundreds of other warlike communities with their own petty interests. So it's a very, very complicated issue, and it comes down to the interpretation of this material. On the one hand, when the Brahmins say that a woman becomes when she marries outside her community, she becomes unclean, she becomes impure, the offering she makes to the ancestors will not be accepted. Now, do we make offerings to the ancestors directly? When we perform rituals for the Pitars, usually the Brahmins are involved as middlemen. So this is the element of self-interest I'm talking about, where they can withhold that privilege from you. On the other hand, if you decide not to feed your ancestors, whose loss is it? It's your ancestors' loss. It's not yours, right? You eat all that food and you grow fat and healthy and happy. Who's going to get upset here? So this is all how you look at it. Have you lost something when somebody tells you can't do this? It's a mental thing. When somebody tells you can't do this, you're impure, you're unclean, you start thinking, okay, maybe they're right. But what if they aren't? What if that's not how you should be looking at it in the first place? which is why I'm going to again stress that all these things are subject to interpretation, and interpretation never comes without bias, self-interest, all those things which we refuse to acknowledge. We say scholars, scientific. I am very, very suspicious because I know about myself. When I write something, I know that a little bit of my fundas seep in. So I think we should be honest in acknowledging that. And let's also talk about the question of gender here. Okay, so man rose to the top of the food chain not by being the cleverest, not by being the most resourceful. Man rose to the top of the food chain by being the most savage predator out there. And who's the biggest threat to male rule? It would be women, because only women are that equal and opposite force. And therefore, when women are denied education for a big chunk of our history, when only men are educated, not women, very few exceptions to that rule, then you are definitely at a disadvantage, because again, male interest is perpetuated generation after generation, which is why I think, it's such a blessing. Saiswaroopa spoke about how, you're allowed to do what you're good at with support. We are so privileged that, whether it's Sai, or whether it's me, or whether it's Nandini, we get to use our voices to, share our POV. That itself is something which we've fought for so many generations, to have that privilege and the freedom to share our views, to reclaim the narrative, to change the world one story at a time. So it's something that just needs to be done.
I'd like to say a couple of words here, very, very insightful, Sai and Anuja. You are talking, both of you were talking about two things. One is, of course, this whole concept of pratiloma, where an upper caste woman marries a man of a lower varna. And and Anuja was talking about how the narrative is set by men. I want to give, and I'm itching to give this example. The example is, I was just talking about Gond Rani Durgavati. I want to give her example because she blasts both these myths. So she was a Chandel Rajput. She marries a Gond, all right, and she becomes a queen in a Gond kingdom, and she becomes the Gond kingdom's most beloved queen, so much so that even today she is respected and worshipped like as an incarnation of goddess Durga. So you have an upper caste, so-called Rajput woman, who comes and becomes the queen of a tribal kingdom, and she becomes so respected, so important, so beloved for her people that they now worship her as an incarnation of the goddess Durga. And she is a woman. Remember, she ruled. Her husband died. So she's a woman. So she ruled. There is, so the point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of the narratives that we talk about, and we tend to talk about caste, class, gender, and I agree with Anuja that it is a huge privilege to be able to voice your POV, because if you look at history, our history, we go from king to king to king to king. How many times do we talk about our brilliant queens? But the point is that it takes one very strong voice to break all of those stereotypes that we are talking about here. And there have been such voices right through history. I mean, Durgavati is just one example. There are many, many examples, but obviously this forum is not about our feminist queens. This forum is about inter-caste marriage. But the point I'm trying to make here is, when we talk about a gender stranglehold, when we talk about a caste playing out in a particular way, for every example in one way, there are exceptions which prove that example wrong. And Durgavati is one such example. There are many others. And all it needs is one strong woman's voice to prove all of those stereotypes wrong. And this woman did it 500 years ago. Remember, she's not a modern woman. She's not sitting in 21st century India. She was in, 16th century. And she was breaking those stereotypes. And she's not the only one. There were others as well. So what I'm trying to say is that when we are talking about these narratives, it is important. It is in fact imperative that we celebrate these voices, that we don't look at our narrative only and only as a question of women being subjugated by caste or gender stereotypes, because that is not true. That is not true. That
All
narrative is not
right,
true.
all right. So actually, this brings me to my another question. Looking at the larger picture, some scholars and researchers are of the opinion that in Greek mythology, when it comes to displays of male importance and power in the patriarchy, they uphold the prominence of men's position in the community and the harsh attitude towards women. So, in my opinion, we can see similar patterns in Indian mythology. So, do you think our mythical texts are gendered?
If I can come in again, I think the
Yes, please.
source texts are not gendered, Chandna. You can, other panelists can agree or disagree with me. But the adaptations, the retellings, and the way it has been passed through, right? So when I talk about Ramayana or Mahabharata, majority of people would remember what they were told by their grandparents or parents. They don't remember the source text. They wouldn't have read the source text. I mean, I'm not judging. It's the source text translation is 6,000 pages, so it's not a simple job. The Mahabharata is 6,000 pages of English text translated, so it's not a simple job to read that. But the way it has been passed through, it has a lot of focus on the male protagonists, right? The journey of the male protagonists, and females do have a very strong role, because in the source of Mahabharata, right, and there is a very what do you say, the upakhyana, right, the sub chapter in Vanaparva, where Markandeya, he explains two stories, the story of Sita and the story of Savitri to the Pandavas. So the context is like Draupadi was taken away by Jayadratha, and the Pandavas went and fought with Jayadratha, rescued Draupadi, and the experience is understandably traumatic. And there is this servant maid of Draupadi who talks very inappropriately. She's, shut up by Yudhishthira. I've been told by Yudhishthira to shut up, but she passes a lot of inappropriate comments on the way, Draupadi was kidnapped by Jayadratha. So Yudhishthira puts the same question to Markandeya, and Markandeya tells him the example of Sita. And in Markandeya's version of Ramayana, there is no Agni Pravesham episode. The moment Rama utters that, expression of he never doubted Sita, but the moment he says something like, how can I accept you back? Gods come, gods come and protest. It's not, it's not common people protesting against a king, but gods come and protest and say, what the hell is wrong with you, Rama? Why are you behaving like, a fallen man? And Markandeya stops his narrative here and says expressing a doubt on Draupadi's character by anybody, it is equal to expressing a doubt on Sita. It's going to make the gods angry, right? And then he tops it up with Savitri's story, where in Sita's story, Sita was in danger and Rama needed to step up and protect her, right? And in Savitri's story, it's Satyavan who dies, and Savitri needed to step up and rescue her husband from death. So here Markandeya he's balancing both the roles, saying a wife and husband should be so balanced that, you should step up when she needs you and she should step up when you need her. And he says, yes, she is as pure as Sita, and, you guys should, regroup and protect her. And Victory helps Satyavan get his kingdom back. being with Draupadi is going to enable you to fight and get back your kingdom. So that's where Markandeya balances that gender role very beautifully, balances out. And this is the exact nuance that gets lost out in retelling, right? Which is why I think there is a need to review the retellings, revisit sources, and review these retellings which have been gendered.
All right.
As Saiswaroopa says, it's when it comes to the retellings, nuance gets lost because at its heart, I don't think mythology is gendered at all. Because there are lots of powerful women characters, and we come from a culture where the goddess is worshipped above all else. We say that even Shiva is Shava, or a corpse without Shakti, which is the power that animates all in existence. So we come from a culture that celebrates femininity, and it's so tragic that the things have changed over the years. And I think we have to talk about the influence of Victorian Puritanism, which seeped into the retellings of our mythological texts. So the initial friars, the missionaries who had access to this material, they probably were interested in preserving the historical context of these texts, or maybe they wanted to establish that this was pagan material which deserved only to be burnt. Whatever, there was an agenda at play there. Victorian Moors came in, which is why you have this. Wherein earlier feminine sexuality was highly celebrated in the land where Kama Sutra was written. You have your Sita and your Draupadi, who were considered examples of chastity. But you also have women who embraced their sexuality, whether it's the goddess like Ganga, or the nymphs, the Apsaras, who did not feel they had to be bound by social conventions. And you have Mohini, again, who was very, very upfront about her sexuality. So you have characters like this as well, because the many faces of the feminine divine were very carefully chronicled in our text. But over time, we started becoming more and more restrictive when it came to female desire, and we started talking only about the women who were worshipped as faithful to their spouse, and who put their spouse's interest ahead of their own. So once that came in, once we started having this very we tried to squeeze all women into the same mold. That's when I think it started becoming problematic, because girls were expected to be like Sita or Kannagi or Arundhati. And Saiswaroopa mentioned how during the Agni Pravesha, the gods intervened. The gods intervened and said, Rama, why the hell are you doing this? You can't cast suspicion on her character. But when it comes to, and in Draupadi's case, when the attempt was made to disrobe her, Krishna himself came and he saved her. But in real life, when you shove women into flames, flames won't leave them untouched. No god is going to come forward and help you. And there's no Krishna there when men forcibly disrobe women and parade them naked as a mark of shame. So this is where we have to understand that on the one hand you have our mythology celebrating gods, and we still worship those gods, which is damn cool. But you also have to be practical when it comes to applying this material to real life, because there's a lot there which talks to you about how you should negotiate all the societal
Right, right.
challenges thrown up. So if you get carried
Yes.
away with the divine aspect of it, you're missing the
Uh,
forest for the trees,
yes.
basically. Or is it the other
Yes.
way around?
We have a question from the audience. We have a question. We'll just take this question quickly. I'll just read it out. Women in Greek civilization had very little empowerment. Where is Indian mythology? Uh, does the moderator see parallels? Okay. Actually, this is not my session. We'll continue with the questions for our speakers. So, I'm very intrigued to ask you this as a reader and a literature student, that as a writer, do you consciously choose these mythical characters and shape them according to your interpretation to build the contemporary narrative? And to what extent do you exercise your creative liberty?
Uh, I'd like to say one word here. Although I do not write about characters from our Itihasa, that is Sai and Anuja's prerogative, and they do such a brilliant job of it. But I have been very fortunate in writing about some fantastic women characters from our history. And I can tell you for a fact that, obviously, when you are writing, I truly believe that every book is a narrative. So every single book, whether it is fiction or non-fiction, is a narrative, and it is the author's narrative, right? So if I'm writing a book, obviously a little bit of me will go into the book. But having said that, there is enough evidence in our history to show that women were not really without agency. You know, in fact, there have been very, very strong women popping out of our history, and it is unfortunate that in the last 70 years or so, the focus has been our history focus has been so overwhelmingly male oriented that we seem to have forgotten some of these very strong, very powerful, and very, very independent women voices. And to that extent, I think when we are writing about history, historical fiction, or narrative history, the job that little bit that we are contributing is to bring forth those voices back from the dead. We seem to forget that those voices were there to begin with, because we are so obsessed with one the great to another the great to another the great, Alexander the Great, Ashoka the Great, Akbar the Great. Where are the women the great? So and it's not as if they were not there. It's just that we have chosen not to look at them, and that is our fault. That is the fault of the way we read history. That has nothing to do with our past. So in a sense, you can call me a history evangelist, and I'm sure Sai and Anuja would agree, because they are doing the exact same thing with our itihasa as well. That we bring out voices which have been overlooked for whatever reason. I don't want to get into why they have been overlooked, but they have, and it's time that we sort of look at some of those voices as well. And a very quick point here, Sai and Anuja were both talking about Savitri and Satyaban, where Savitri steps in and rescues or brings Satyaban back to life. It's very interesting to know that there is a folk version of this story as well. So there is a very popular folk tradition in Bengal called Monosha Mongol Kappo. Monosha Mongol Kappo. It's about a minor goddess called Monosha. She's a goddess of snakes. And in that particular story, it's a sort of semi-tribal kind of story in which the snake comes and bites Behula's husband, Lokindor, and she goes all the way up to to the gods to petition for her husband's life. So what I'm trying to say is that this story is very close in its core. Not that it follows the same trajectory, but it's the same thing, that the goddess Monosha curses Lokhindor's father, Chand Saudagar, and sends her cobra to bite Lokhindor. Lokhindor dies, and Behula says, "No way am I going to allow this, is unfair, and I will go to the end of the world to make sure that my husband's life is restored," and she manages to do that. So agency, this is what I'm trying to say, that even in folk traditions, there are stories of this kind of agency, and all we need to do is just look.
All right.
So, Anuja's point about Victorian Puritanism reminded me of a certain incident, Chandana. There is this beautiful work on, female agency in sexuality called Radhika Santwanam in Telugu. It's a classical Telugu, right? It's written by a courtesan called Muddupalani, who existed in 17th, 18th century, right? Anuja, early 18th century or late 17th century. right? And the work is so bold and courageous, right, about a woman expressing her sexuality. And the 17th, and this woman was assisted by two of her scholarly gurus, Brahmins, who were her scribes and editors. She acknowledges them in the first section, right? So the 17th century society did not have a problem with Muthupallani writing, that bold literature. But the 20th century British government had a problem with it. They banned the book. And finally, in 1930s or something, just before our independence, there was a scholarly panel who negotiated some partial release of that book. They agreed to censor some of the very profane parts of the book, and because they just felt that this has to be brought up to the masses. But unfortunately, in this whole 2-3 decades, we lost the original text of Radhika Santwanam, and today we have a so-called sanitized version of it. That's something which, even Nandini's point about going and looking for those voices, that task of going and searching for those lost voices because of this false Puritanianism, that the task lies upon us.
Actually, just to add to that about Radhika Santwanam, it was a Devdasi named Bangalore Nagaratnamal who was responsible for preserving it in some way at least, which is
In
such a
some way.
huge thing. She put in so much effort. She fought the British, she fought the censors to get this published. So, and now that we're talking about the Devdasis, again, it's a misconception that these women were high class call girls who were exploited and all stuff like that, who belonged to one particular community. It's again, if you study the material, you realize that these were highly cultured women who had access to education that was comparable with what only the Brahmins and highborn Kshatriyas had access to. So these women were highly skilled practitioners of music and dance, and they were granted gifts of land by the king if they performed very well. They were given entire villages which were exempted from taxes. So the income generated from these villages were entirely their own to use as they see fit. So we're talking hardcore power here. These were feudal lords back in the day. Powerful,
Yes,
powerful women
right.
who had a say in how the country was governed because they had the ear of the king, his courtiers. Those were the circles they moved in. They had these salons called samanas where all the movers and shakers of the day were invited for good conversation, for good music and dance. So but later on when the British came, these Devdasis weren't allowed to perform in temples. The source of their income was taken away, which is why so many had no choice but to probably take up prostitution or something like that. But for the longest time, these were women who had agency and they did not belong to one caste. There were no restrictions about who could be devoted to temple service. So, if some families felt that their daughters had the necessary attributes to shine as a Devdasi, they would dedicate these girls to the temple, and they came from all backgrounds, from from
Yes.
extremely moneyed backgrounds to girls who were very poor but who it was felt were talented. So again, it's very limiting to say they belonged to one caste. And Brahmins are accused of cultural appropriation because the dance of the Devdasis survives as Bharatanatyam thanks to the efforts of Rukmini Devi. Okay, so again, that is a very, very short-sighted way of looking at the narrative because the Brahmins didn't appropriate anything from any one community. You have to give credit where it's due. They did serve, they did protect this art form, and they gave it respectability, which allowed it to survive. Okay, so it wasn't just one community stealing from another community. It's far more complicated, and this applies to a lot of things when it comes to intercaste, caste-based discussions. It's complicated, but we tend to simplify it to the barest essentials, where only the bias survives, I think.
All right. Thank you
One
so
quick
much.
point here. I want to
Okay.
just make a quick point here.
Yes,
While
yes.
we were talking, I totally agree with Sai and Anuja. If you look at British history, you will find that they totally lionize their queens, whether it is Boudica, whether it is Queen Elizabeth the First. They Victoria, Queen Victoria, and all. They really lionize their queens. Whereas when we look at ourselves, we find that, apart from Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, and, once in a while we mention Ahalya Bai, once in a while we mention somebody like Razia Sultan, who had a 3-year reign. So she didn't really leave, have a long enough reign to leave an imprint.
Yeah.
We don't talk about our Viranganas. I don't know why. And we have so many of them over our last 2500 years. We have so many Viranganas. I don't understand why our history and the way we look at it does not talk about these characters. And that, I think, is a major lacuna. That is agency. That is what we are denying our predecessors.
All right. Actually, because of the paucity of time, we'll have to wind up the session. It was a fabulous conversation and it was great having you all here. Thank you for sparing your time to join us and thank you for sharing your wonderful insights with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was pleasure interacting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.